Today we're going to talk about client creation um, and what actually happens when you call client.create, and then the subsequent kind of convenience method that we built on top of it, which is called build. Um, but under the hood also calls client create if we're talking about it from the protocol perspective. Um, so so let's start here at what happens when you say client.create and you pass it some sort of params. So the required parameters for this, and I'm going to speak about this kind of coming from the mobile SDKs, and so things might be a little different. But the things that you are absolutely required to pass are a signer and what we call like a signing key or a signer. Oops, a signer and um, an address, which is honestly kind of associated with the signer. So I actually think that's in the signer. Sorry, I'm like looking. Yeah, so the signer actually has the address. So that's actually only on build. So you're required to pass the signer, which is the thing that actually does the signing. And this is kind of an interface that like a wrapper around things that you have to conform to. So your actual wallet is kind of wrapped in this XMTP signer. And then client options. And the client options are required in V3 for one reason in particular is because we require a DB encryption key. So in V3, there is a local database that gets created when you call create. And we add an extra layer of encryption on that database just so that things are not stored in plain text inside of this local DB. Um, so things are encrypted at the at the MLS layer, but then we also just have this kind of additional encryption layer after it's been decrypted and it's stored in your local database. So the DB encryption key is required. The other things that come in client options are the API, which is also required. This, if you don't set it, gets defaulted to dev. This is where you say, I want to point to the production, dev, or local network. Um, you also have a history sync URL, which I feel like in every single one of these, I say, we'll talk about this later, which we will talk about this later. And you have the option to pass in a few other things, like a DB directory. This, is helpful for people who have maybe multiple databases that they're managing. And then there's some additional optional items like event callback, which is helpful if you're catching the signer, if you care to catch, so that like if your app is stuck in this signing flow. So you pass in a wallet and you pass in your client options with your DB encryption key that you store somewhere so that you never lose this. You need this DB encryption key anytime you build or create your client. So what happens when you call create? Well, first and foremost, it does a split here. It takes the address from the signer and it passes it in to it looks at our identity ledger, like our place where we store all of the identities on the network. And it says, is there an inbox ID already associated with this address? And if there's an inbox ID already associated with that address, then let's use that inbox ID. The other flow is that it does that no matter what. So so it says use this inbox ID because I found it. If it doesn't find an inbox ID, then it says create a new inbox ID for this address. So this is your identity on the XMTP network, is this inbox ID. And this is what will kind of be uniquely identifiable on V3. So in the past, kind of addresses were uniquely identifiable. Addresses always map to a single inbox ID. So you can still use an address to associate with an inbox ID, but your identity on the XMTP network now is actually this inbox ID. Um, so that's step one on create is finding or creating an inbox ID. After you have the inbox ID, it goes and it calls this low-level create function on libxmtp. And this right here is creating, a, a reference on libxmtp for you to use, which is your database. So what this create function does is it takes a bunch of stuff that you don't see here. One is a database, uh, a place to store your database. Right now, the way that we name your local database is based off of the environment that you're using, um, and your inbox ID. So your database is stored locally on your device. If you're using Android, it's, in some data file for your app, and it's, and inbox ID, something like XMTP, DB, and inbox ID, and this is a SQLite database. Um, and so this creates this database. And this is important because as long as this database exists, you um, you don't have to do any, like, the second this database is created, you have an installation. And as long as this database exists, this installation will always be the same. The second that you delete this database or rotate your encryption key, your DB encryption key, anytime you change anything where this database is no longer accessible, you're going to have to create a new installation. And so that is important because you have the option when you're creating your app or whatever on top of XMTP to allow your users to wipe their DB or not. But the ramifications of wiping your local DB is that you're going to have to get a new installation. And with a new installation, that means you lose all of your conversations and messages from your local database. You'll get your conversations back. You won't get your messages back unless you have history sync. Again, another talk. um, so you create this database inside this database. So if you're familiar with our V2 network, you'll know that in V2, there was like a key that you could import into stuff. And I can't spell import. There was a V2 key that you could import into a create so that you could create the same identity twice. So that was insecure. And so in V3, we store and rotate a key package in your local database. This gets rotated at some sort of interval, and as long as that key package exists in your V3 database, then your installation is valid. So that's step one, is creating this local database. And since V3 is built so strongly around this local database, it's a really important step. So after the local database is created, some other stuff happens, but it kicks back out. It says, hey, I created a successful client, and now I need you to sign. And so then it kicks back out and it says, I need a signature from a wallet to actually register this identity on the network. So you have a new installation. It needs to get registered on the network because you're on this create inbox path. And now it sends out a signature. So what happens is the app says, I need a signature, and you kick out to whatever place you're going to sign. The user takes a signing action, or if you have like an embedded wallet, it signs, and it comes back into the app, and now you can register your identity. So then you register your identity to the XMTP network. So this is when now the whole network knows that you have a new installation or you have a new identity, whichever one it is. This signing only happens when you're creating a new installation. And maybe this is your first installation, so maybe you're also creating an inbox ID at the same time. But this sign is only required for this one path when a new installation is being created. So it registers this to the identity registry, which means that now anybody on the network can see that you have a new installation. And this is important because if you watch my previous video, or I guess it's going to be my next video on syncing, the sync method looks to see if there are new identities that have been registered since the last time it's sunk that haven't been added to groups. And so this right here is where it'll look and it'll be like, oh, somebody recently signed, made a new installation, and this installation needs to get added to like these 8 groups. And that way they have access to them. So that's the final piece of create. This is all handled inside of our SDKs. It's actually like, 3 or 4 separate calls to our actual like back end that we kind of abstract away to make it a little bit simpler. So that is create. But what about building? I feel like I should probably just put this on a new layer. So create is oh my gosh, build. Build. Um, you'll find out very quickly that spelling is not my strong suit. Um, so build is an abstraction that the SDKs have done to make it clear that that you don't need a signer every single time that you log in. So you just went through the create flow that I just showed. You created a client. You created your local database. It has an installation ID. The local database exists, valid key packages, et cetera, et cetera. And now you're like, every time the user backgrounds the apps and reopens it, I need to build this client. So like a very common flow, and like especially in mobile app development, is that you create a client on initial login, and then every additional open of the app, you just build it so that the person doesn't get dropped on the login screen every single time. So under the hood, all that build is doing to make this simpler for you is it's still calling create, but it's giving you the ability to just use your inbox ID because you know that because it's been created, or an address, an inbox ID actually, or an address because this, if you give it an address, we have to make a call to find your inbox ID. If you give it the inbox ID, it cuts that loop down. So it's like one less network call. So it's actually like speeds up the call quite a bit. So I would recommend passing both to build. And then your client options, because you have to, like I said previously, you have to store this encryption key. So if you pass anything in on your client options, it has to get passed every single time. So if you specified a DB directory, make sure you pass it here, because we don't store that information. So the encryption key also definitely pass it. If for some reason you lose your encryption key, you store it incorrectly, I don't know, and you try to call build with something incorrect, that these client options don't match what happened when create was called, you will get an error because it'll say, I'm trying to create a new installation because I can't access the local database. It'll think that the local database doesn't exist because you can't access it because you don't have the right things to access it. Like if you forget to pass the DB directory, it's going to be like, there's no local database here. If you don't pass the encryption key, it's like, I don't know what you're trying to find. And then it's going to require a signer. So if you see an error that's like, you tried to create, but you didn't pass the signer, that means that somewhere in this build, the local database no longer exists, or the local database is no longer reachable. And so then you would need to call create again or figure out why you can't reach it. So on build, the only abstraction here is it's allowing you to not sign again. What happens is it goes through the same create. I guess I kind of already said it goes through the same create. It goes through the same create where it like tries to find the local DB. It, looks for the identity, et cetera, and then it creates the client. And the only piece that changes here is that there is like a needs signature type of thing that the backend tells you if it needs a signature or not, and you won't get this callback. So you won't register an identity and you won't need to sign anything. And it'll just drop you right into the app. It'll use your old local database and you won't lose your messages or conversations. It won't rotate your installation key. Does anybody have any questions?
I can maybe jump in quickly. I'm not sure if you mentioned it, but what's the point again of mentioning our own DB directory? Because I know in Converse that's what we do, but what's the pros and cons of doing that? Like, why do we do it? I think we do it because of obviously notification, and we may need to make sure because using both React Native and Swift. But yeah, curious on pros and cons of doing that.
Yeah. So the reason that we added DB directory is because inside of iOS in particular, there are and this is my understanding, is there are these things called shared containers. Um, and if you want to have a happy life, you want your databases to both exist in the same shared container. So if you don't specify a DB directory, I think we put it into like the documents. I can confirm that on iOS directory. So your database would be in this documents, the libxmtp one, the XMTP one, and then it wouldn't be in the shared container, which makes your life easier, I think, for push notifications and other things. Um, if you're trying to access, like in this scenario, it would be like apps, the app database and the XMTP database, having them in the same shared container can make your life on iOS easier. So I think that is one of the reasons to put it in a DB directory.
I can add one thing here. So the library XMTP lib or any these kind of libraries are independent of what your decision or where do you want to store your data. So that's the reason, one, we are independent of the OS. We don't know what's your OS, what's the preferred location for your application, where do you want to put your data. So that's the reason that you need to pass first the database directory and secondly your key, because on different OS, different devices, you have like a safe vault that you can store this kind of data. So that's the reason that we leave it to the integrator to pass this kind of data.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of what he just said, like we do choose a default for the DB directory if you don't specify it, but it is probably not the place, or maybe you don't care. But but yeah, on the app side, we do specify a default. For encryption, we do not specify a default. Um, it is required that you store it in likely in some secure key storage.
So would it follow that once we remove, or if we move to HMAC for push notifications, and remove that notification extension, don't need the app groups anymore, it'd probably be safe for Converse to drop that XMD, the database location management.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. Yes, I think that that was the motivation for why it was inside of the app that you're referencing. Um, Initially, that being said, I don't know if it's easier for React Native because you're doing it on both iOS and Android to have control over the DB directory. But in theory, I mean, we have a React Native example where we don't specify the DB directory and it works fine. So it's
Right. Right.
really up to the developer
Cool.
and their
Cool.
use case.
That helps. Another question I have is, I guess it's probably related to the key material, but I'm just curious why it's up to the client to have to build or create, and that's not on the React Native layer. Is that something we could move to the React Native layer and the clients wouldn't have to worry about it? Or
Uh, it you could call create every single time. The problem with you never have to actually call build. The problem with calling create and is every single time is that it requires a signer. And so I gave you the option to call this function build so that you don't
oh,
have to hold on to a signer. Like the
gotcha,
reason why I don't make the signer optional is that I want to make it really clear that when you're creating for the first time, you have to pass a signer.
something's gonna sign.
Um,
Okay,
yeah. And when you're calling build, the signer isn't even an option. So it's just a really clear delineation of like the signer is only required on create.
and
But you
stupid,
could call create with a signer every single time. I mean, if you
gotcha.
have the signer, like if you're a wallet, like there's no like you're not doing anything harmful by calling create every single time.
Okay, okay. And then just a follow-up question to that. Once we go decentralized, my understanding we'd have to sign it, but it would be independent of XMTP, like sending messages. I'm just curious, like, won't there need to be a signer once we're decentralized or no
No,
for each message? Okay.
different
Different
tech
thing.
talk. There's
Okay,
a paywall.
okay,
There's a paywall, and
okay,
it's not tied to your create. I will
okay.
say, in terms of one thing that I probably didn't touch on, that's probably something that I wanted to touch on, is when you So I just talked about how inbox ID is like you can only have one inbox ID associated with your address. It's kind of your identity on the network. Uh, there are a few, interesting protocol level things here to know about this is if you were, and this is maybe a different talk, if you wanted to add your address to a different inbox ID, you would lose access to this inbox ID, and you would now be associated with the new one. If you like get compromised, or maybe it's not compromised, if you reach the limit of like how many times you can create installations, which is 256, you can log in, you can create a new installation 256 times before you reach the limit of how many installations you can have. And this is actually identity records. So it could be revoking. There's other things that could reach this 256. You would need to get a new inbox because you no longer can log in on this inbox. And something I didn't mention here is that on this create inside of libxmtp, there's a nonce. And this nonce allows you to rotate your inbox ID if needed. So if you reach this limit, or for some reason, whatever, you can rotate your inbox ID. You're going to lose all your conversations. You're actually going to lose all your conversations. You're going to have to start from scratch. You'd have a new identity on the network, it'd be a new inbox ID. But we do have the ability to rotate your inbox ID with a nonce. That's a really deep conversation that I'm probably should do. Like adding wallets to an account and revoking wallets is probably a whole nother conversation for another talk.